The first light of dawn crept across the quiet Queen's townhouse as Julian Vance slipped the key into the lock, praying the hinges wouldn't creak. His breath still carried the fading trace of Dorian Black's sandalwood and whiskey scent, sharp, expensive, the kind of omega pheromone that made alpha instinct stir in ways Julian had spent years learning to suppress. The kind of scent Evelyn could never afford, and Julian never should have known. He stepped inside, shoulders tense, blazer slung over one arm. His shirt was wrinkled from a night he swore he'd never admit to. The silk tie he'd left with Dorian was missing, and his collar carried the unmistakable shadow of another man's teeth marks, carefully placed, deliberately hidden beneath the fold. Then his foot struck something. A sharp plastic clatter echoed down the hallway. He froze. Right under his shoe lay Leo's police cruiser toy, the one Julian had bought in a guilty rush during his late-night meeting excuse. The bright blue car, scratched from hours of play, sat abandoned in the middle of the floor like a tiny witness waiting for him. Its siren light was cracked. Julian had bought it 3 weeks ago. Leo had barely put it down since. At the end of the hallway, curled on the living room couch, Leo slept in his sweatshirt, the one that still smelled faintly of Julian's alpha scent, the one he reached for when he had nightmares. His small arms wrapped around a blanket, as if he'd waited until his eyes couldn't stay open. Beside him, a lamp burned low, proof he'd been awake far too late. And in the armchair next to him, his son, 5 years old, dark curls pressed against a pillow, clutching the police cruiser like a shield. Julian exhaled slowly. At least Leo hadn't woken. But then another presence stirred in the room. In the armchair, wrapped in a throw blanket, sat Julian's husband. Not sleeping. Waiting. Marcus Vance lifted his head, his omega scent, usually warm cedar and honey, now tinged with something sour, something distressed. His hair was mussed from the long night, dark circles bruising the skin beneath his eyes. Not from sleep. From exhaustion. From worrying alone. He blinked, adjusting to the morning light. Then his gaze found Julian. Shirt half-tucked. Tie missing. Hair tousled. Carrying the unmistakable scent of another omega. Marcus didn't speak at first. The silence said enough. Julian swallowed. There was a crisis at the office. I had to stay. I didn't want to wake you. Marcus's eyes dropped to Julian's shirt. The buttons were done unevenly. He always buttoned them for Julian when he rushed for work. Julian never made mistakes like that. His gaze rose again, slower this time. The pain behind it cut deeper than any accusation. Leo waited for you, Marcus whispered, voice trembling just enough to betray the hurt he tried to hide. He thought you were coming home to read him the new book. He kept asking. Julian shoved his hands into his pockets. His thumb brushed over something soft, a silk ribbon. He didn't remember taking it from Dorian's hair. Panic shot through him. He kept his hands down. He shouldn't wait up, Julian muttered, harsher than intended. He knows I work late. He's 5, Marcus replied quietly. He only knows his dad didn't come home. A beat of silence. A siren wailed in the distance, distant but haunting. Leo's toy police cruiser might as well have been echoing it. Marcus stood, placing a blanket over their son. We'll talk later, Julian. When he's not here. His voice was calm. Too calm. The kind of calm that meant something inside him had already cracked. Julian's stomach twisted. Because for the first time, he realized, the toy he nearly crushed wasn't just plastic. It was the first fracture in a lie big enough to destroy everything he thought he controlled. Morning sunlight filtered through the thin curtains of the Rhodes townhouse, painting soft stripes across the living room. Gentle. Warm. painfully deceptive. To anyone walking past the windows, the home looked perfectly peaceful, a small family getting ready for a new day. An alpha heading to work, his omega preparing breakfast, a little boy humming as he played with his favorite toy. But inside, everything felt like glass about to shatter. Marcus Vance moved quietly through the kitchen, hands steady though his heart was anything but. He cracked eggs into a pan, trying to focus on the familiar rhythm of cooking. But Julian's scent still lingered in the air, not the scent he knew, the clean cedar and rain aftershave he always wore, but the faint sandalwood and whiskey of another omega. Twice, Marcus washed his hands. The smell wouldn't leave. In the dining area, Leo sat on his knees on a chair, rolling his police cruiser along the table edge. "Daddy's going to read the book tonight, right?" he asked, eyes bright with the innocent hope only children still carried. Marcus smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "We'll see, sweetheart." Right on cue, heavy footsteps came down the stairs. Julian, dressed in a crisp white shirt and charcoal suit jacket, moved with the cool confidence of an alpha who believed he still controlled the narrative. He grabbed his Montblanc pen from the counter, slipped it into his jacket, and checked his reflection on the microwave door. "Big day," he said, brushing imaginary lint off his sleeve. "I've got a meeting early. Don't wait for me tonight." Leo's face fell. "But Daddy, what about the new book?" Julian barely glanced down. "Another night, buddy." Marcus watched his son deflate. He held his breath, hoping Julian would at least kneel, touch his shoulder, say something fatherly. He didn't. Instead, his phone buzzed. An alert flashing across the screen. He snatched it quickly, but not quickly enough. Marcus saw the name, Dorian. His stomach turned cold. Julian tucked the phone away with a shallow breath. "I'll call you later," he told Marcus. But his eyes avoided his husband's entirely. He headed toward the door. Leo ran after him, tiny hands holding out the toy police car. "Daddy, you forgot to say goodbye." Julian sighed, crouched just enough to pat Leo's hair. "Goodbye, champ." No hug. No kiss. No real warmth. The door clicked shut behind him. Marcus stood frozen for a moment, spatula in hand, watching not the door but the empty space Julian left behind, a space that had been growing wider for months. Maybe years. Then he turned, wiped his hands on a towel, and forced a soft smile for Leo. "Come eat, sweetheart." But as he set the pan down, his fingers brushed against Julian's suit jacket, draped over a chair. Left behind in his rush. And there, peeking from the pocket, a Cartier cleaning cloth. Marcus's heart stopped. It started with little things. The kind of things Marcus once brushed off because marriage, real marriage, wasn't perfect. People got tired. People got stressed. People drifted and returned. That's what he used to believe. But the cracks were no longer subtle. That evening, after Julian rushed out the door with a clipped, "Don't wait up," the house felt colder than usual. Not physically, Leo still ran around in dinosaur pajamas, humming as he played, but emotionally. Like someone had quietly opened a window and let the warmth escape. Marcus loaded the dishwasher, trying to shake off the strange pressure in his chest. Every time he blinked, the Cartier cloth peeked through his thoughts like a sharp whisper, "That wasn't for you. It was never for you." His hands shook as he scrubbed a plate. He couldn't stop imagining who the bracelet belonged to. And when Julian had given it. His internal storm was interrupted when he noticed Julian's iPad on the counter, lighting up. Julian had forgotten to log out of his Apple account. A rideshare receipt displayed across the screen. The Plaza Hotel. 12:41 a.m. Marcus stared at it for a long moment, pulse thudding in his ears. His breath caught. His vision blurred. The room seemed to tilt under his feet. "Daddy?" Leo appeared beside him, clutching the wheel of his police cruiser toy. His small face scrunched with concern. "Are you sad?" Marcus's first instinct was to lie, to wrap his son in a bubble where adults didn't break promises and love didn't disappear overnight. But his throat tightened, and all he could manage was a soft, "Daddy's just tired, sweetheart." Leo crawled into his lap, warm and trusting. The innocence of a child could both heal and destroy. "Papa said he was working," Leo murmured, eyes drooping. "He said he promised." Marcus froze. "He promised." The words sliced deeper than the receipt. Deeper than the perfume. Deeper than anything. Because Julian had lied to Leo too, not just to him. Later that night, after putting Leo to sleep, Marcus wandered into the hallway. The house looked different. Colder. Unfamiliar. Almost hollow. Julian's office door was slightly open. Maybe it was instinct. Or maybe Marcus already knew. He stepped inside. The room carried his alpha's scent, cedar, ink, something metallic. Papers were scattered across the desk. But one object caught his eye, a folded receipt tucked beneath his Montblanc pen. Marcus slid it closer. Luxury car service. Round trip. Client, Mercer Holdings. His breath stalled. Mercer. Dorian Mercer. His heart pounded so hard he thought the walls might hear. And then, another sound. A faint, muffled sniffle. He turned. At the doorway stood Leo, rubbing his eyes. "Daddy? Were you crying in Papa's room?" Marcus knelt, pulling him close. "No, baby. Daddy's okay." But he wasn't. Somewhere deep inside, something was beginning to break. Quietly. Irreversibly. The next morning, Marcus woke with an ache behind his eyes, the kind that came from a night spent holding back tears. He moved quietly, preparing Leo's lunch, while the house remained too still. Julian had already left. No goodbye. No explanation. Not even a note on the counter. By midday, a thought gnawed at him. What if all the signs were wrong? What if he was imagining everything? The hope was fragile. But it was still hope. And he clung to it like a last rope keeping him above water. So he made a decision: he would surprise Julian at his office with Leo. Just like the old days. A simple lunch. A reminder of the family waiting for him. Maybe then he would know whether the man he married was still in there somewhere. Leo held his hand tightly as they entered the gleaming lobby of Park Avenue Tower. The marble floors reflected the soaring glass above them. Julian had always been proud of working here. "This place is the future," he used to say, voice full of ambition. Marcus approached the receptionist. "Hi, we're here to see Julian Vance." The woman smiled politely, then hesitated. "He isn't in a meeting right now." But he did step out briefly. "Step out?" Marcus repeated. "Do you know where?" Before the receptionist could answer, Leo tugged on Marcus's sleeve and pointed toward the wide glass doors leading to the street. "Daddy, look!" A pair of figures were walking toward the curb. Julian and Dorian Black. They looked perfectly in sync. Too close. Too familiar. Julian leaned down, saying something that made Dorian laugh, a soft, confident laugh Marcus had never heard from him before. Dorian's hand brushed Julian's arm lightly, like a touch he'd repeated many times. Marcus's breath caught. His legs turned to stone. He watched frozen as Julian reached out and tucked a loose strand of Dorian's hair behind his ear, a gesture he used to do to Marcus when they were dating. Before stress. Before lies. Before whatever this was. Dorian leaned into him. And for a moment, the world went silent. No traffic. No lobby chatter. No sound except the cracking of something inside Marcus's chest. Leo whispered, "Daddy, is Papa hugging that man?" Marcus couldn't answer. He couldn't breathe. Then Julian's gaze lifted. He saw Marcus. And Leo. Standing there like ghosts from a life he thought he could hide. His face drained of color. He dropped his hand from Dorian so fast the Omega flinched. "Marcus, wait, this isn't," Julian stammered, taking one step toward them. But Marcus stepped back. Leo gripped his arm, confused, hurt, sensing something terribly wrong even if he didn't understand it. Dorian, unfazed, simply lifted his chin and observed Marcus with a slow, knowing smirk, as if to say, "You're too late." In that instant, the last thread of denial snapped. And Marcus finally understood. He had just witnessed the truth he'd been afraid to face. The drive home was silent. Not the peaceful kind. This was the silence that presses on your chest, the kind that makes every breath feel heavier. Marcus kept his eyes on the road, hands tight around the steering wheel, while Leo stared out the window, clutching his police cruiser toy without a word. He didn't understand what he'd seen. But he understood enough to feel hurt. The moment they stepped into the townhouse, the air felt wrong. The warmth that once filled their home had evaporated, leaving behind a strange hollow chill. Marcus set his keys down and leaned against the counter, steadying his breath. Minutes later, the front door swung open. Julian marched in, his face already twisted with irritation. Not guilt. Not remorse. Not even surprise. Just anger that he'd been caught. "What the hell was that, Marcus?" he snapped, voice low but venomous. "Showing up at my office like some obsessed Omega. Dragging Leo along to spy on me. That was humiliating." Marcus's jaw trembled. "Humiliating? Julian, I saw you with him. Laughing. Touching him. How long has this been going on?" Julian scoffed, loosening his tie. "Don't be dramatic. It was work talk." "Work talk?" Marcus's voice cracked. "You tucked his hair behind his ear." Julian flinched, barely. But enough for Marcus to see truth flash in his eyes. Then the mask returned. "You're reading too much into things," Julian muttered. "You always do. This is exactly why we fight. You can't control your emotions." Marcus swallowed hard. "Julian, please. Just tell me the truth. I deserve that much." Instead of answering, Julian poured himself a drink, whiskey, 2 fingers, and downed it in one swallow. "You know what your problem is?" he said, pointing the empty glass at Marcus. "You've become boring. Predictable. You stay home, you take care of the kid, you wear the same damn cardigan 3 times a week. I need a partner who understands ambition. Someone who pushes me to be better. Not someone who drags me down." Marcus's breath hitched. "I drag you down. I left my job to raise our son. I held this family together while you climbed your precious ladder." Julian slammed the glass on the counter. "And look how far I've gotten. Do you think I could walk into boardrooms with you constantly needing reassurance, slow?" He stopped himself mid-word. But it was too late. He had almost said Dorian's name. Leo peeked from the hallway, small face worried. "Daddy? Papa? Why are you yelling?" Julian pinched the bridge of his nose. "Go to your room, Leo. This isn't your concern." The boy flinched at the cold tone, clutching his toy tighter as he disappeared down the hall. Marcus's eyes filled with tears, not from weakness, but from something inside him finally breaking. "You promised us a family," he whispered. "You promised him better than this." Julian shrugged and reached for his phone. "Promises change. People change. You'll adjust." It was the moment Marcus realized Julian didn't just betray him. He didn't believe Marcus had the strength to walk away. But that would be his first mistake. That night, after the shouting had settled into cold silence, Marcus felt smaller than he ever had in his life. Julian had shut himself in his office with another drink, the door locked as if Marcus were the intruder in his own home. The house was dark, except for the soft glow from Leo's bedroom, where Marcus sat at the edge of his bed, watching his son's chest rise and fall as he slept. He smoothed Leo's hair back, blinking away the tears that kept gathering despite his best efforts. Leo didn't deserve this. He didn't deserve a father who walked out emotionally long before he walked out physically. When Marcus finally returned to the hallway, exhaustion hit him like a wave. He leaned against the wall, sliding slowly to the floor. His hands trembled. His breath came out in small, uneven pulls. He wasn't just tired. He was unraveling. The living room felt ghostly, the half-finished laundry, the toys scattered across the rug, Julian's abandoned whiskey glass on the counter. The Cartier cloth still sat where Marcus had left it, mocking him with its quiet glamour. And then his phone buzzed. He almost ignored it, expecting another automated bill reminder he couldn't bring himself to open. But when he glanced at the screen, his heart stuttered. A message from an unknown number. "Marcus, it's Lucas Whitmore. I'm not sure what's going on, but you didn't look well today. Call me if you need anything." For a moment, Marcus just stared at the text. Lucas. A name from a different lifetime, back when Marcus was a nurse, back when saving someone meant something, back before he became the shadow of a husband he hardly recognized. He set the phone down. He wasn't ready to tell anyone. Not yet. His knees finally gave out, and he sat on the cold hardwood floor, burying his face in his hands. The sobs came uncontrollably, quiet at first, then desperate. The kind that come from a place the body has tried too hard to protect. He cried for his marriage. He cried for his son. He cried for the version of himself he had lost somewhere between Julian's ambition and his own sacrifice. In the middle of his breakdown, a small voice startled him. "Daddy?" Leo stood there in dinosaur pajamas, rubbing his eyes. He carried his police cruiser toy under one arm. Marcus wiped his face quickly. "Sweetheart, go back to bed. Daddy's fine." "You're crying," Leo whispered. Marcus opened his arms, and Leo ran into them, clutching his neck tightly. His small warmth undid Marcus all over again. "Did Papa make you sad?" Leo asked into his shoulder. Marcus's throat closed. He couldn't answer. He wouldn't make his son carry that burden. So he whispered, "Daddy's just tired. But I'm right here. And I'm not going anywhere." Leo nodded sleepily and rested his head on Marcus's chest. In that moment, something shifted inside Marcus. He wasn't ready to fight. But he was done being afraid. He just didn't know yet that his greatest ally was already watching, and waiting for the moment he'd need him most. 2 days passed after the disastrous confrontation at Julian's office. The tension in the Vance household thickened like humidity before a storm. Julian came home later, angrier, more defensive. Slamming doors. Pretending Marcus didn't exist unless he needed something. Meanwhile, Marcus lived in quiet survival mode, holding himself together for Leo, hiding his heartbreak under the routine of breakfast, laundry, bedtime stories. But the truth had already slipped out of Julian's control. Late one evening, after Julian left again for another meeting, Marcus sifted through a stack of mail on the kitchen counter, bills, statements, a charity flyer. Then his iPhone buzzed. A new message from an unknown number. His stomach tightened as he opened it. "You don't know me. But I know your husband. And you deserve to know the truth. Check the audio file." Attached was a single voice memo. Marcus hesitated, glancing at the stairs to make sure Leo was asleep. Then he tapped play. Julian's voice filled the room. Cold. Confident. Careless. "Marcus?" "He's harmless," Julian said, laughing lightly. "He's dependent. He won't leave. He can't. I've kept all the accounts under my name. If he walks out broke." Another voice, Dorian Black's, smooth as silk, "And the kid? He's attached to you, isn't he?" Julian scoffed. "He'll get over it. Kids adapt. Besides, once the promotion is locked, I'll have grounds to push for custody. Marcus can't afford a custody fight. He doesn't even know where half our money is." Silence. Then Dorian whispered something that chilled Marcus to his core. "As soon as you get that VP position, we move forward. No more hiding." Julian hummed in satisfaction. "Exactly. Once I'm VP, I'm untouchable. And Marcus becomes irrelevant." The recording ended. Marcus's hand flew to his mouth, stifling a sob. His knees weakened, and he sank onto the dining chair as though the world had tilted. It wasn't just cheating. It wasn't just betrayal. Julian was planning to erase him. Financially. Emotionally. Legally. The Alpha Marcus had built a life with wasn't just unfaithful. He was ruthless. Marcus's phone buzzed again. "There's more. He's not who you think he is. If you want everything, meet me tomorrow at 2 p.m. Café La Brisa, Brooklyn. Do not tell him." His pulse hammered, fear, relief, dread, hope all tangled into one. Who was this person? Why help him? How much did they know? 1,000 questions swirled. But one thing was clear, someone wanted him to win. Someone inside Julian's world. Someone with access. Marcus tightened his grip on his phone. This wasn't just betrayal anymore. This was war. And for the first time, he wasn't the only one fighting. The next afternoon, Marcus stood outside Café La Brisa, a small Brooklyn coffee shop tucked between a flower stand and a vintage bookstore. The bell above the door jingled as he stepped inside, warm scent of espresso, faint jazz humming overhead. His palms were damp. He kept checking the time, 1:58 p.m. He chose a corner table facing the entrance, heart pounding with every person who walked in, a mother with a stroller, a pair of college students, a delivery driver. No one who seemed like they'd secretly recorded Julian plotting to destroy his life. Then, exactly at 2 o'clock, a man approached his table. Tall. Mid-40s. Sharp eyes behind thin metal glasses. A charcoal blazer, hair in a sleek cut. He moved with quiet authority, like someone used to boardrooms, not cafes. He sat down without asking. "You don't know me," the man said, voice low but steady. "My name is Marion Pierce. I'm a senior auditor at Mercer Holdings." Marcus blinked. "Mercer, as in Dorian's family?" Marion nodded. "I oversaw internal review for the merger proposal Julian is bragging about. Which, by the way, he's dangerously unqualified for." Marcus stiffened. Hearing someone else say Julian's name in that context felt oddly jarring. Marion folded his hands. "I sent the recording. And I'm contacting you because things are worse than you think. Marcus's throat tightened. Worse? How? Julian isn't just cheating, Marion said calmly. He's funneling personal expenses through corporate accounts. Hotel rooms. Car services. Jewelry. All charged as client meetings. If this continues, it could trigger a federal audit. Marcus felt his stomach twist. Why tell me? Why now? Marion sighed, leaning back. Because Dorian thinks he can run the company through Julian. And Julian, blinded by ambition, is letting him. But he's sloppy. Reckless. If he drags Mercer Holdings into scandal, hundreds of jobs could be affected, including mine. So you're protecting yourself, Marcus whispered. And you, Marion replied. You're the only person with enough motive to expose him without looking like a corporate plant. Marcus swallowed hard. I don't want revenge. I just want to protect my son. That's exactly why you'll win, Marion said. But you need protection first. He slid an envelope across the table. Inside were printed statements, highlighted expenses, and Marcus's breath hitched. An itinerary Julian had used last month, listing a client retreat in Los Angeles. The hotel, the Beverly Hills Ritz-Carlton. 2 guests. 1 room. Marcus's chest constricted. Proof. Actual, undeniable proof. Marion lowered his voice. This is enough to destroy his promotion, his credibility, and his leverage in family court. Use it wisely. Marcus stared at the documents, hands trembling. Why are you risking your job? He whispered. Marion's expression softened for the first time. Because I watched my sister go through the same thing. He didn't get help until it was too late. Then he leaned in, voice nearly a whisper. And because someone you know is also watching out for you. Marcus froze. Someone I know. Marion nodded. Lucas Whitmore. He contacted me this morning. The world tilted. Lucas? Why would he? Marion stood. There's more coming. Stay strong, Marcus. Then he walked out, leaving Marcus breathless, holding the first real weapon he'd ever had, and the terrifying realization that he was no longer fighting alone. Julian sensed it the moment he walked through the door that evening, the shift in the air. Marcus wasn't hovering anxiously the way he usually did when Julian arrived late. He wasn't pleading for answers or offering a lukewarm dinner reheated twice. He sat at the dining table with a calmness that felt foreign. Unsettling. Almost dangerous. His hands rested on a plain envelope. Julian froze. What's that? He asked, trying to sound casual and failing miserably. Marcus didn't look up. Something we need to talk about. Julian's jaw clenched. He loosened his tie, pretending he wasn't rattled. If this is about earlier. It's about everything, Marcus said quietly. Julian swallowed hard. Marcus, don't start. But Marcus pulled the papers from the envelope and slid them across the table. Highlighted transactions. Hotel bookings. Car service receipts. The Beverly Hills Ritz-Carlton itinerary. Julian's name printed clearly. Twice. Julian's face drained of color. Where did you get this? He demanded, voice low, almost a growl. It doesn't matter, Marcus replied. What matters is that I know. Julian snatched the papers, scanning them frantically. His breath quickened. His hands shook. You don't understand what you're playing with. This could ruin. You already ruined things, Marcus whispered. Then came the moment Julian's mask cracked entirely. He slammed his fist on the table, making Leo's art supplies rattle in the center bowl. "You think you can use this against me?" he hissed. "You think anyone will believe you over me? I have the job. The salary. The lawyers. You have what? A box of crayons and a nursing license you haven't used for years." His words hit harder than any physical blow. But Marcus didn't flinch. Julian stepped closer. Too close. "I will not let you take Leo," he said, voice shaking with fury. "You can walk away from this marriage if you're too weak to handle real life. But you will not take my son." Marcus's breath caught. "Your son. He's our son." "No," Julian snapped. "Judges don't care about your feelings. They care about stability. Income. Status. I can give him all of that. You can barely pay for groceries." Marcus's heart twisted painfully. "And I'll do it again," Julian snarled. "Try to fight me, and I'll drown you in court filings until you beg me for mercy, until you hand over Leo because you can't afford to keep him." Marcus felt the room spin. Not from fear, but from realization. This was no longer a broken marriage. This was a battlefield. Julian straightened his jacket, regaining his icy composure. "Get rid of these papers. I'm warning you, Marcus. Don't make this uglier than it needs to be." Marcus stared at him, breathing hard, hands trembling beneath the table. Julian smirked, certain he'd regained control. But he didn't notice the shadow in the hallway. Leo, clutching his police cruiser toy, eyes wide with silent terror, having heard every word. And for the first time ever, he wasn't looking at Marcus for comfort. He was afraid of his father. The house felt different the next morning. Heavy. Tense. Like the walls themselves were holding their breath. Marcus moved quietly, his mind racing with every threat Julian had thrown at him the night before. He barely slept. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Leo's terrified expression in the hallway, clutching his police cruiser toy like a shield. He had to protect him. He had to protect himself. And that meant gathering proof, real proof, before Julian made good on his threats. When Julian left for work, slamming the door hard enough to rattle the frames, Marcus waited until his car pulled away. Then he went into Julian's office. His hands shook as he opened drawers, searching through documents, receipts, anything that could expose the truth behind his alpha's lies. Most of the drawers were filled with dull corporate paperwork. But on the bottom shelf, shoved beneath an outdated laptop sleeve, he found a small black folder. His heart thumped as he opened it. Inside were printed itineraries, meal receipts, and photos of credit card statements, yet Julian had once sworn that he kept all finances digital. And tucked between the pages was the most damning piece, a toy store receipt dated 3 weeks prior. 2 identical police cruiser toys. Purchased at the same time. Marcus's breath stalled. Julian had told Leo he bought the toy on his way home from the office, claiming he'd seen it in a window and thought of him. But the time stamp on the receipt told a different story. It was purchased at 11:27 p.m. Julian wasn't at the office then. He wasn't home. He wasn't even in Queens. He was near the Plaza Hotel. And the second toy, who was it for? Marcus's stomach twisted. He pictured Dorian's perfect smile, the way he'd leaned into Julian like he belonged there. Did Julian buy the toy for Dorian's nephew? His cousin? Or, God help him, did he leave it in a hotel room while he was with him? Before he could finish connecting the dots, he heard small footsteps. Leo stood in the doorway, rubbing his eyes. "Daddy? Why are you in Papa's office?" Marcus forced a soft smile. "Just cleaning up, sweetheart." Leo walked in slowly, police cruiser toy clutched in one hand. "This toy, I saw Papa put another one in his bag one night. It looked the same. He said it was for a friend." Marcus froze. "A friend?" Leo nodded innocently. "A man friend. He said he needed help. But he looked scared when he said it." The room tilted slightly. His son had seen more than he realized. He remembered more than Julian expected. Marcus crouched, pulling Leo into his arms. "Thank you for telling me, sweetheart. You did nothing wrong." And as he held him, something shifted inside Marcus. Not fear this time. Resolve. Because the toy wasn't just a toy anymore. It was evidence. It was truth. It was the thread that could unravel Julian's entire web of lies. And Marcus was finally ready to pull. The courthouse hallway buzzed with low murmurs and shuffling footsteps. But to Marcus, it all sounded like static. He sat on a hard wooden bench beside his attorney, palms cold, heart pounding. The polished floors, the towering ceilings, the scent of old paper and stress, everything felt intimidating, designed to swallow people like him whole. But this wasn't about him. It was about Leo. Across the hall, Julian stood with his high-priced lawyer, a man in a sleek gray suit who looked like he'd been built by the glare. Julian wore confidence like armor, smoothing his tie, smirking when his eyes briefly met Marcus's. He thought he'd already won. He thought the courtroom belonged to alphas with money and arrogance. He hadn't understood that desperation, real desperation, could make an Omega stronger than any dollar he owned. "Mr. Vance," the bailiff called. It was time. Inside the courtroom, Marcus sat at the petitioner's table, hands clasped tightly. His attorney whispered, "Remember, truth is on our side." But truth didn't feel like enough when Julian walked in behind a wall of confidence, carrying the polished presence of an alpha used to controlling every room he entered. The judge, a middle-aged Omega with tired eyes and a voice that brooked no nonsense, adjusted his glasses. "We're here to discuss temporary custody and financial arrangements during the separation." Julian's attorney rose first. "Your Honor, my client has grave concerns about Mr. Vance's emotional stability. He has a history of erratic behavior, including entering Mr. Vance's office without permission, taking private documents, and involving the minor child in marital conflict." Marcus's breath caught. Erratic. Unstable. Julian was already rewriting the narrative. His lawyer stood calmly. "Your Honor, what Mr. Vance discovered in that office were financial documents showing misuse of corporate accounts and evidence of Mr. Vance's extramarital activities." A faint ripple moved through the courtroom. Julian stiffened. His lawyer forced a scoff. "Accusations without proof." "We have proof," Marcus's attorney said, placing a stack of documents on the evidence table. "Hotel records. Ride-share receipts. A toy purchase used to create a false alibi. And a recording in which Mr. Vance clearly states he intends to cut Mr. Vance off financially and pursue full custody to destabilize him." Julian's face drained of color. The judge lifted a brow. "Mr. Vance, is this true?" Julian rose abruptly. "Your Honor, that recording was taken without my consent. This is a witch hunt. Marcus is trying to destroy my career because he's threatened by my success." Marcus swallowed hard. "I'm trying to protect our son." Julian shot him a glare sharp enough to cut. The judge held up a hand. "Enough. I have no interest in your marital disputes. But I am deeply concerned by the evidence of coercive financial control and the alpha's stated intention to manipulate custody." Julian's jaw dropped. "Manipulate? Temporary joint custody," the judge ruled firmly. But Mr. Vance, you are ordered not to restrict Mr. Vance's access to funds. Any violation will weigh heavily in future decisions. Marcus exhaled shakily. For the first time, Julian wasn't untouchable. And he knew it. The courthouse steps felt colder than they should have under the late morning sun. Marcus walked down them slowly, still shaking from the hearing. He had survived. Barely. But the weight of Julian's glare lingered like a bruise. As he reached the sidewalk, his phone buzzed. A single text. We need to talk. It can help you. LW. Marcus's breath quickened. Lucas Whitmore. The name hit him like a memory he had tucked away, a hospital room years ago, an alpha fighting for his life, Marcus's hands steady as he worked beside the trauma team. Lucas had thanked him afterward, saying Marcus had saved more than just his heartbeat. Marcus never imagined he'd hear from him again. Lucas asked to meet at a quiet bench overlooking the East River. When Marcus arrived, Lucas was already there, tall, composed, dressed in a navy coat that matched the calm authority in his posture. But when he stood, his expression softened. Marcus, he said gently. I'm sorry you're going through this. Marcus tried to smile. It faltered. You saw the hearing? No, Lucas replied. But Marion filled me in. Marcus's eyes widened. You know Marion? He reports to the charity board my foundation works with, Lucas explained. When he mentioned irregular activity involving Julian, I recognized the name. Marcus sank onto the bench, overwhelmed. So you know. Lucas nodded. I know enough to be concerned. Julian isn't just having an affair, Marcus. He's playing with corporate funds. And he's digging himself into a pit he won't climb out of. A hollow ache grew in Marcus's chest. He said he would take Leo from me. Lucas's jaw tightened. He won't. Not if you stay smart. He paused. You're stronger than you realize. Marcus shook his head. Strong? Lucas, I can barely sleep. I'm scared all the time. And Julian, he's ruthless. He knows the system. He knows how to twist things. Lucas studied him for a quiet moment. That's why you need people who know how to twist them back. Before Marcus could respond, Lucas pulled out a thin folder. These are internal compliance notes related to Julian's recent transactions, he said. Nothing illegal yet. But enough to show patterns. It strengthens your case. Marcus took the folder with trembling hands. You didn't have to do this. I know, Lucas said softly. But I wanted to. Something in his tone made Marcus's chest tighten, not with fear this time, but with an unfamiliar warmth. He hadn't felt seen in years. Not truly. Lucas leaned forward slightly. Marcus, someone like you shouldn't be fighting alone. Good people attract allies. Even when they don't realize it. A gust of wind brushed Marcus's hair. And for the first time in weeks, he felt air fill his lungs without pain. I don't know what comes next, he whispered. You don't have to, Lucas replied. Just know you're not alone anymore. And in that moment, sitting beside the alpha whose life he'd once saved, Marcus realized something powerful. Someone had come back to save his. In the days following the court hearing, Julian grew increasingly erratic. The once polished, calculating alpha who obsessed over image now stumbled through the house with a simmering rage he could barely contain. Every missed call from the office made him snap. Every quiet moment stirred paranoia. He had felt untouchable for years. Now the ground beneath him shifted like sand. Meanwhile, Marcus moved differently. Not confidently, not yet. but with a steadiness that frightened Julian more than any accusation. Marcus was no longer crying. No longer pleading. No longer reacting to his Alpha's storms. And Julian hated losing control. One evening, while Julian angrily typed emails in his office, Marcus tucked Leo into bed. Only after Leo fell asleep did he notice his phone vibrating, a message from Marion. Something's happening inside the company. Be ready. Marcus felt his pulse jump. Before he could respond, another message came through, this time from an unknown number, but the tone unmistakable. Your husband's days at Mercer Holdings are numbered. Dorian is making moves. Marcus's breath caught. Dorian, the Omega Julian believed was his golden ticket. A cold realization trickled down his spine, Dorian was never on Julian's side. He was on Dorian's side. And now that Julian's scandal threatened his family's empire, he would cut him loose without hesitation. That same night, Marcus overheard Julian on the phone, pacing the living room. What do you mean they want to pause the VP nomination? That promotion is guaranteed. Do you know who I'm involved with? I have connections. A beat of silence. Then Julian's voice cracked. What does Dorian have to do with this? The fragile confidence in his tone made Marcus freeze in the hallway. He listened, jaw tightening, eyes going dark. Dorian recommended who for the role? Julian whispered into the phone. Silence. A strangled laugh escaped him. You're joking. But the tremor in his hand said he knew it wasn't a joke. He ended the call abruptly and sank onto the couch, gripping his hair. The image was almost surreal, Julian Vance, the alpha who once towered over Marcus with arrogance, now shrinking under the weight of someone else's power. Marcus remained hidden in the hallway, watching. For the first time, he saw not a husband, not a villain, but a man who had built his entire identity on a foundation of lies, now watching it crumble. He stepped backward, ready to return upstairs, when his phone buzzed again. A video file. Sender unknown. He opened it. And his blood turned cold. It was footage from a corporate security camera. Julian and Dorian in a conference room, arguing. Dorian pointing at Julian with disgust. Julian pleading. Dorian laughing. Then 5 words that changed everything. You were never the plan. Marcus covered his mouth, not because he pitied Julian, but because he understood something powerful. His enemies were beginning to eat each other alive. And he wasn't even fighting. Not yet. The next morning, the townhouse carried an unnatural stillness, like the air was holding on to a secret it couldn't wait to release. Marcus walked downstairs to find Julian already dressed in a crisp navy suit, hair slicked back, jaw tight. He looked like an alpha preparing for battle, not for work. He didn't greet Marcus. He didn't look at him. He simply stared into the mirror, adjusting his tie with trembling hands. You're up early, Marcus said quietly. Julian finally turned, eyes sharp. We need to talk. Marcus's stomach tightened. That phrase, coming from Julian, never meant good news. Julian stepped closer, lowering his voice. I know you've been talking to people. I know you've been digging. His lips curled slightly. You think you're smart, Marcus. But you have no idea how deep this world goes. Marcus folded his arms. I'm protecting myself and Leo. Protecting? Julian scoffed. You're sabotaging. And if you don't stop, you'll regret it. Marcus held his gaze. Is that another threat? Julian smirked, slipping on his watch. No. Just a reminder of what happens when you bite the hand that feeds you. Marcus felt a flicker of anger, quiet but burning. I don't need your hand, Julian. Julian stiffened. For the first time, he saw it, the shift in Marcus. The fear had thinned. Something else simmered beneath his voice. Julian didn't like it. You want independence? Julian said coldly. Fine. Let's speed this along. He opened a folder he'd brought downstairs and tossed several documents on the table. I'm offering you a settlement. You sign this, you get minimal spousal support, and we agree on shared custody. No more fights. Marcus scanned the papers. His heart lurched. Minimal support. No claim to assets. Shared custody with no protections. And a clause preventing him from mentioning Julian's professional conduct. It wasn't a settlement. It was a muzzle. He pushed the folder away. I won't sign that. Julian's jaw twitched. You will, because you don't have a choice. You have no job. No income. No leverage. But he stopped. Because Marcus pulled out his phone, tapped the screen, and turned it toward him. The video. The recording of Dorian sneering, "You were never the plan." Julian went pale. Where did you get that? He whispered. Marcus didn't answer. He didn't have to. Julian staggered back a step, breathing hard. That's taken out of context. It means nothing. Dorian and I are finished, Marcus said softly. And he's replacing you. The blow landed. Julian's face crumpled, pride buckling under the truth. But before either of them could speak again, Marcus's phone rang. A number he didn't recognize. He answered cautiously. Hello? A measured voice replied, Mr. Vance? This is Evelyn Hale, executor of your mother's estate. I believe it's time we discussed your inheritance. Marcus froze. Inheritance? His mother left nothing. Or so he'd been told. Julian stared at him, confused, and suddenly very interested. What inheritance? He demanded. But for the first time, Marcus smiled. Not yours to know, he said quietly. And at that moment, something shifted in the universe, the first taste of Julian's consequences, and the first spark of Marcus's rise. The morning after the call about his mother's inheritance, Marcus stepped outside to find a strange quiet settling over the neighborhood. Too quiet for a weekday. Birds chirped. Cars passed. But there was a tension in the air that hadn't been there before. He didn't understand it until his phone buzzed, a message from Hannah, a dad from Leo's school. Are you okay? I saw the post. I'm so sorry. Marcus frowned. Post? He opened the attached link. And his breath hitched. A local gossip blog, notorious for exposing Manhattan executives, had published a blind item clearly about Julian Vance. Park Avenue Finance VP nominee caught in messy affair. Legal battle with Omega husband over custody. Sources claim unstable spouse causing drama. Though they didn't name Marcus outright, the wording painted him as the problem. The comments were worse. Typical stay-at-home Omega drama. He's emotional. The alpha's successful. Happens all the time. He'll milk him for every dollar. Marcus's chest tightened. This wasn't an accident. This was Julian trying to control the narrative. He felt exposed. Humiliated. Angry all at once. But the real blow came at school pickup. Two dads stepped away when Marcus approached. A third offered a tight, pitying smile. One whispered too loudly to be an accident, his husband's affair is all over the blogs. Can you imagine? I heard he barged into his alpha's office screaming. Marcus's cheeks burned. He wrapped his arms around himself, suddenly aware of every wrinkle in his clothes, every dark circle under his eyes. Then he saw Leo running toward him, waving his police cruiser toy. "Daddy, look! I showed my class my car." Marcus forced a smile. "That's wonderful, sweetheart." But behind Leo stood his teacher, Mr. Langley, expression uneasy. "Mr. Vance," he said gently. "I wanted to check in." Leo seemed withdrawn today. He asked if his papa was going to replace him. Marcus's heart cracked open. "He said that?" Mr. Langley nodded. "I didn't want to intrude. But children feel more than they can say." Marcus swallowed hard and thanked him. But inside, a storm raged. This wasn't just hurting him anymore. It was bleeding into Leo's life. That evening, things worsened. As Marcus turned onto their street, he saw Julian standing outside the townhouse, shirt rumpled, hair mussed, phone pressed to his ear. He looked furious. The moment he saw Marcus, he hung up and stormed toward the car. "You think you're clever?" he snarled. "You think leaking things about me helps you?" Marcus stared at him, stunned. "I didn't leak anything." "Liar." Julian's voice rose. Neighbors peeked through curtains. "You embarrassed me publicly." The firm called. "They want explanations." "Maybe they're starting to see the truth," Marcus said quietly. Julian stepped closer, face inches from his. "If you don't stop this, I'll burn everything down. And I'll make sure you go down with it." Marcus felt his fear twist into something sharper. Something steadier. Because he now understood what Dorian, Marion, and Lucas had already figured out, Julian wasn't just spiraling. He was cracking. And cracks always lead to collapse. For the first time in weeks, the house was quiet in a way that didn't crush Marcus. It steadied him. After the chaos of the gossip leak and Julian's street corner meltdown, he felt something unexpected settling inside him, clarity. Not strength, not yet, but the faint promise of it. That evening, after Leo drifted off to sleep with his police cruiser toy beside him, Marcus walked downstairs and found the envelope from his mother's estate still unopened. His fingers trembled slightly as he slid a nail beneath the seal. Inside was a single sheet of paper, simple elegant handwriting. "For when you finally remember who you are." Beneath it, documents detailing his mother's forgotten investment, a small share in a community medical center that had since partnered with the Whitmore Health Foundation, Lucas's foundation. Marcus's breath caught. The shares weren't worth millions. But they were worth enough to prove he wasn't financially helpless. Enough to show a judge he could rebuild. Enough to invalidate Julian's threats that he would walk out broke. For the first time in a long time, Marcus felt a flicker of dignity return to his chest. But the change didn't stop there. The next morning, he dropped Leo at school early, then walked into a downtown bookstore, somewhere he hadn't visited since before parenthood. He wandered the aisles aimlessly, fingertips brushing book spines, until one caught his eye, Atomic Habits. He had heard of it. People said it helped them feel unstuck. Helped them rebuild piece by piece. Something about the simplicity of the cover drew him in. He bought it and tucked it into his bag, feeling oddly proud of himself for spending money on something meant just for him. He then took a bus across the bridge to Brooklyn and approached Whitmore Health Foundation, where Lucas had offered to help him look into part-time nursing opportunities. Marcus wasn't sure he could go back to the long shifts, the emergencies, the emotional exhaustion. But he wanted to try. He wanted his life back. Lucas greeted him in the lobby with a smile that was warm without pity. "You came," he said. "I need to start over," Marcus replied softly. Lucas nodded. "Starting over doesn't happen in a leap, Marcus. It happens in steps. Today is a step. They talked in Lucas's office, overlooking the Brooklyn waterfront, about Marcus's qualifications, the clinics that needed help, the training he could resume. Lucas didn't pressure him. He simply guided. Before Marcus left, Lucas handed him a coffee. "You're doing better than you think," he said gently. Walking outside, Marcus felt lighter. Not healed. Not whole. But moving. Later that night, he sat at the kitchen table reading the first pages of Atomic Habits while the house settled into its nighttime hush. For the first time in weeks, his tears weren't from heartbreak. They were from hope. Because building himself back didn't feel impossible anymore. It felt inevitable. The courthouse felt different the second time. Less like a place built to intimidate him, more like a stage where truths finally stopped hiding. Marcus walked through the heavy wooden doors with his shoulders straighter than before. Not fearless, not yet, but no longer breakable. He carried a slim folder, inside it, the inheritance papers, the compliance notes Lucas gave him, and Marion's documentation of Julian's misconduct. His weapons. His protection. His voice, finally sharpened. Across the aisle, Julian entered like an alpha trying to reassemble a shattered ego. His suit was immaculate. But his eyes were hollow, ringed with exhaustion. And for the first time, he didn't look at Marcus with superiority. He looked at him with suspicion. His attorney leaned toward him. "Remember, deny everything. Question his stability. Emphasize your income." Julian nodded. But his jaw twitched. The judge entered, calm but firm. "We are here to revisit custody arrangements and financial disclosures. Mr. Vance, we will begin with your documentation." Julian stood, trying to project confidence. "Your Honor, I have provided all necessary statements." Marcus's attorney rose. "Your Honor, that is not accurate." The judge gestured for him to continue. "We have evidence Mr. Vance withheld financial documents, misreported corporate expenses as personal income, and provided false explanations for late-night travel." He placed a set of highlighted documents on the evidence table. Julian's head snapped toward Marcus. "What is that?" "Truth," Marcus whispered. The judge examined the papers. A subtle frown deepened on his face. "Mr. Vance, these expenses do not match what you submitted. They are fabricated." Julian insisted. "They are pulled directly from Mercer Holdings' internal reviews," Marcus's attorney cut in smoothly, verified by senior auditor Marion Pierce. The courtroom murmured. Julian paled. "And furthermore," the attorney added, "Mr. Vance no longer meets the financial instability criteria Mr. Vance alleged. He has verified inheritance assets and confirmed prospects for re-employment." Julian blinked hard. "Inheritance?" The judge nodded approvingly at Marcus's documents. "Mr. Vance, this changes your economic standing considerably." Marcus breathed for what felt like the first time all day. Then his attorney delivered the final blow. "We also submit video evidence of Mr. Vance's inappropriate relationship with Mr. Dorian Black, contradicting his claims of marital cooperation and stability." Julian's voice cracked. "Marcus, you can't, this will ruin me." The judge raised a hand. "Mr. Vance, control yourself." And then the unthinkable happened. The courtroom door opened. A bailiff whispered into the judge's ear. His expression sharpened. "Mr. Vance," the judge said, "Mercer Holdings has issued a formal statement during these proceedings. You are suspended from your position, pending investigation." Gasps filled the room. Julian staggered as if struck. No, this is a mistake. Dorian wouldn't, he needs me." But Marcus already knew, Dorian had cut the final thread. And Julian was falling. The judge's voice echoed through the stunned courtroom. Given this new information, custody will remain in Mr. Vance's favor until further notice. Marcus closed his eyes, not in triumph, but in relief. He wasn't losing his son. He wasn't losing himself. And Julian's empire, once towering above him, was crumbling at last. The news spread through Manhattan faster than Julian could deny it. By noon the next day, financial blogs, corporate forums, and even LinkedIn threads buzzed with one headline: VP nominee suspended amid internal misconduct review. They didn't mention his name outright. But everyone in his industry knew. They always knew. By late afternoon, the whispers reached the marble lobby of Mercer Holdings, where Julian stood frozen in front of the revolving doors. He had arrived determined to clear the air, convinced he could fix it all with charm and excuses, just as he always had. But when he tried scanning his badge, access denied. A security guard approached, stiff and professional. "Mr. Vance, you'll need to come with us to collect your belongings." Julian's mouth fell open. There must be a mistake. The guard didn't blink. "Sir, this is a directive from the board." Julian followed him numbly to the elevator. The ascent felt like an execution. On the 42nd floor, the floor he once bragged he'd rule, coworkers glanced up as he walked by. Some looked away quickly. Others watched with thinly veiled satisfaction. A few whispered, "Is that him?" Dorian really set him up. He shouldn't have tried to drag his family into it. Dorian. Julian's heart hammered. He spotted Dorian's office door open. The Omega stood inside, perfectly composed, wearing a cream-colored blouse and a calm smile. "Dorian," Julian breathed, stepping forward. "You have to tell them. This suspension is a misunderstanding. I defended you. I protected you." Dorian held up a manicured hand. "Julian, don't make a scene." "A scene?" Julian's voice cracked. "You promised we would build something. You said you needed me." "I said I needed someone," Dorian corrected smoothly. "Not necessarily you." Julian's world tilted. "Dorian, please." Dorian sighed, almost bored. "The board asked me if your conduct compromised the company. I told them the truth, it did." Julian staggered. You threw me under the bus to save yourself?" "No," Dorian replied with a polite smile. "I replaced you." The guard beside Julian cleared his throat. "Sir, your office." Julian's legs buckled as he followed, each step heavier than the last. He packed his belongings, a few framed certificates, a Mont-Blanc pen, a stress ball Leo once gave him, into a cardboard box. Everything that once made him feel powerful now looked pathetically small. On his way out, he caught his reflection in the glossy lobby wall. The confident alpha who once strutted through these doors was gone. Replaced by someone hollowed out, exposed, and terrified. Outside, cold wind hit his face as his phone buzzed with messages he didn't dare open. At that same hour, across the river, Marcus prepared dinner with Leo. The kitchen smelled of pasta and basil. Soft music played. For the first time in months, he felt peace settling into the corners of his home. He didn't know Julian had fallen, not yet. But he felt something, a shift in the air. A loosening of the invisible chains Julian had wrapped around his life. Julian had spent years believing he could not fall. But gravity comes for everyone. And his descent had only just begun. 2 weeks passed after Julian's public collapse. And for the first time in what felt like years, Marcus woke without dread pressing into his ribs. The air in the townhouse felt lighter, as if months of tension had finally seeped out through the cracks. Morning sun warmed the living room. Leo hummed softly while coloring at the table, his police cruiser toy parked neatly beside him. Life was settling. Not perfectly, not completely, but beautifully enough. The legal updates came slowly, then all at once. Marcus's attorney called with the final confirmation: Julian's suspension is now a full termination. You have sole temporary custody, likely to become permanent. And your inheritance has cleared probate. The shares are officially in your name. Marcus gripped the counter to steady himself. So I'm really going to be okay? No, the attorney replied warmly. You're going to be better than okay. Marcus hung up and let the truth wash over him. Relief bloomed in his chest so suddenly he had to sit down. Leo looked up from his drawing. Daddy, why are you smiling like that? Marcus laughed through tears. Because, sweetheart, our life is changing. And it was. The next few days unfolded like scenes from a life Marcus hadn't dared imagine. He met with the medical center board, now partly his board, thanks to his mother's shares, and they welcomed him back with open arms. He wasn't just returning as a nurse. They offered him a transitional role in community outreach, something flexible, meaningful, and stable. You've always had a gift with families, the director told him. We'd be lucky to have you. When Marcus left the building, the sky over Manhattan gleamed a soft gold, reflecting off the river like a quiet promise. His financial footing grew steadier. His confidence grew louder. And his home felt warm again. One evening, Lucas stopped by with takeout and a stack of paperwork Marcus needed to sign for his new role. Leo greeted him with an excited shout, tugging him toward the kitchen. Look, Lucas! Daddy made us a fort. Lucas ducked under the blanket roof, smiling at Marcus as he settled beside Leo. Impressive craftsmanship, he teased softly. His presence was steady. Grounding. Gentle where Julian had been sharp. Patient where Julian had been dismissive. And when he looked at Marcus, it wasn't with pity. It was with respect. Later, after Leo fell asleep, they stood by the balcony overlooking the quiet street. Marcus held his mug of tea close, letting the night breeze lift his hair. You're different now, Lucas said quietly. Different good, or different bad? Marcus asked. Different strong, Lucas replied. Different free. The words reached a place inside Marcus he'd forgotten existed. He wasn't healed yet. But he wasn't broken anymore. His life, his real life, was finally beginning. And with every breath he took, he stepped farther away from Julian's shadows and closer to a future filled with something he had never expected to feel again. Hope. Autumn draped New York in gold the day Marcus felt his life shift for good. Leaves floated over the quiet path at Brooklyn Bridge Park, and the Manhattan skyline shimmered across the water like a brand new promise. Leo ran ahead, laughter echoing as he pushed his beloved police cruiser toy along the wooden planks. Its wheels wobbly, but still rolling. Just like them. Marcus watched him, a soft warmth blooming in his chest. He no longer woke with fear gripping his lungs. The house was calm. Financial pressure lifted. And his new role at the medical center filled his days with meaning instead of dread. Peace didn't feel fragile anymore. It felt earned. He was standing in the glow of that peace when he saw Lucas Whitmore walking toward them, hands in the pockets of his coat, eyes finding Marcus's with quiet certainty. Leo spotted him and sprinted back, crashing into Lucas's legs with a hug. Lucas! I showed my car to the city. Lucas grinned. I heard it had a big day. Marcus's heart fluttered at the easy warmth between them. Lucas wasn't a replacement. He wasn't a fantasy. He was steady, an alpha who arrived without demands, without ego, without the need to be worshipped. He showed up simply because he cared. And today, he looked nervous. For the first time since Marcus had met him. "Marcus," Lucas said gently. "Can we walk for a moment?" Marcus nodded, letting Leo race ahead again. They walked along the waterfront, the cool breeze brushing their shoulders. Lucas took a slow breath. "You once saved my life when you barely knew me," he said. "You showed up when I needed someone, even though you didn't have to. I never forgot that." Marcus blinked, touched. "Lucas. When I saw what you were going through," Lucas continued softly, "I wanted to help. Not because I owed you anything. But because," he paused, steadying himself. "I care about what happens to you. And to Leo." A warmth spread through Marcus. Steadying. Quiet. Lucas reached into his coat pocket, not with a grand flourish, not on one knee, but with a sincerity that felt deeper. "I don't want to rush your healing," he said, voice low. "But I do want to be part of your future. Only if you want that too." Marcus's breath caught. It wasn't a proposal. It was an invitation. To safety. To love. To possibility. He felt tears sting his eyes, but this time, they didn't burn. "I want that," he whispered. "More than I expected to." Lucas exhaled, finally letting his smile break free. "Then we'll build something, at your pace. Something real." Leo turned just then, waving wildly. "Daddy! Lucas! Come see my car go fast." They walked toward him together. Step by step. Behind them, across the river, the towers of Manhattan glinted like witnesses to Marcus's victory. Julian's world had crumbled by his own choices. And Marcus's life had risen from the pieces he tried to smash. He had his son. He had his future. He had his heart back. And at long last, he had love that would not break him. The end.